here now, Prof, I think.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. Hamiduli, we can triplet in technical efficient. Some technical problems there. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this event, and it's good to see to hear that there's so many people here today. I'm Pàdruig Moireasdan, and I'm one of the co-authors of the Gaelic Crisis report, which came out a year ago. Today's seminar is being held to mark the first anniversary of the publication of the Gaelic Crisis. I'd like to thank the UHI's HARC and SILT research clusters for hosting this panel discussion to examine the issues which have arisen from a study's findings and recommendations. And I'd also like to thank yourself, Joe, for your work in organizing everything today. It's much appreciated. So I hope we'll all find the discussion today useful and productive. I'll say a tiny little bit about the background to today's seminar. The Gaelic Crisis report found essentially that the social use and transmission of Gaelic is at the point of collapse in the island. That's in the Western Isles, Staffin, Skye, and in Tiriodh. In light of those findings, we proposed that communities should be placed at the centre of any Gaelic vitalisation efforts, and that a local community trust, or what we termed arisen Gaelic, could be established in the islands as part of those efforts, which would give Gaelic communities more of a say, more control, if you like, over Gaelic development in local areas. So that's a summary of a 500-page book. We have until 12:30 p.m, so we've got an hour and a half scheduled for this event. A little bit now on the structure. Prof. Ó Giollagáin will give a presentation on what's happened since the publication of the report, and this will be followed by a panel discussion, and the panel will share their opinions on the research findings, give their views on future options for Gaelic communities. We're very lucky with the panelists we have today. We have Rhoda Meek from Tiriodh, Conchúr Ó Rhoda, Jane NicLeòid from Leòdhas, Jane, we have Iain MacKinnon from Skye, Conchúr Ó Giollagáin, and Pàdruig Moireasdan from Uibhist. And we'd like to thank them very much for their time. We're looking forward to hearing their view. Guests in the audience will have an opportunity to share their perspectives and ask questions as well. In terms of making those contributions, if you're in the audience, if you can write a question or any comments and address them to Joanna Rogers. Okay, I think that's that. And we'll start now, and it's over to you, Prof, for the presentation.
Thank you, Pàdruig, agus Matan Va. I'll just share my screen. I have a short PowerPoint presentation. Okay, and that should be coming up, and I'll just put it on the slideshow view as well. So thanks, Pàdruig, for the introduction and for chairing the session, and thanks also, as you've done, thanks to Joe Rogers for all the preparatory work in setting this up for today. But before I start, I'll only talk for maybe 6-7 minutes, but before I start, I'd like to thank again the community that helped us with this Gaelic Crisis survey. We have data from over 1,500 people in this book, and if it wasn't for their help and patience in supporting us as we are doing the field work, we wouldn't have been able to publish this study. I'd also like to thank the authors, the team that conducted the work, and many of them are with us today: Gordon Cameron, Pàdruig Moireasdan, Cian O'Connell, Ian Campbell, Brian MacDonald, and Thomas Pethaveri. I also express my gratitude to the sponsors of the Soillse team, the costs involved in the fieldwork, and our sponsors were the Scottish Funding Council, HIE, and Bord na Gaelic. So we're very grateful to them. Also, before I start, I think it's important that we recognise the contributions and dynamic engagements of different community-based groups, especially over the last year. I'm thinking in particular, but not exclusively, about the work and all the interesting insights and activism that has emerged fromÚn and Tiriodh, t-Eilean, Misneach, and the housing activist group in the islands. I think these are all very, very positive contributions and help bring dynamism to the way that we address this crisis. Essentially, what I want to do today is to address a few points to the government and their bodies, Bord na Gaelic, Gaelic bodies in general, and academia, and to make some suggestions for a more fruitful engagement with the community, how we're actually going to move ahead. And I'll just start then the presentation. My point to the government here, you see I have a dual approach. I examine where we are, and then I identify some difficulties for some challenges from further work. Addressing the government on the state systems, it's quite clear that there has been plenty of consultation, and we have to recognize also when you're dealing with government and state bodies that there's a natural anxiety to depart from existing approaches. However, despite all the consultation with communities and groups, essentially what we have is consultation without very much progress. And when we examine some of the agendas of these meetings and consultations, they have the appearance of a containment exercise, and this is done by emphasizing existing agendas rather than moving on and discussing directly the evidence that has been presented over the last year. I think it's quite clear that there's an obvious need to move beyond the non-optimal aspects of current policy, which I believe have emerged from a misdiagnosis that is at the heart of Gaelic policy in Scotland. And I could encapsulate that misdiagnosis in one phrase. Essentially what we have in Scotland is Gaelic promotion without language protection. We don't have time to go into that here, but if people want to look at a series of essays in the recent edition of Scottish Affairs, they'll see that misdiagnosis explained in a bit more detail. Much of the difficulties that the communities are experiencing at the minute, this comes from what I've referred to here in the final point there, the idée fixe, are these fixed ideas that bureaucratic language plans are dynamic enough to help a community that is in crisis or a community that is struggling. And relying on bureaucratic plans at a time of crisis, this is contributing to what I'm referring here to as an official state, and that's arising from the defensiveness of the public bodies dealing with Gaelic affairs at the minute. And allied with that stasis is there's a feeling of impasse in the Gaelic communities, simply because the Gaelic bodies are not addressing their concerns, as have been highlighted in our research and in other research, of course. Moving ahead then to Bord na Gaelic, and if we are to portray Bord na Gaelic's behaviour over the last year, I think we can fairly say that they have been disengaged or dissociated from the crisis. The difficulty with this lack of response, they are contributing to undermining their own credibility, and if they continue in this mode, they will lose confidence among the community. If there is a crisis, official bodies should face up to it. It's indicative that there has been no direct consultation with the authors of the Gaelic Crisis study since its publication this day last year. So we do not know what their thinking is on the findings, on the data, on the depiction of the crisis and on the recommendations that have been made in the book. And instead of addressing the crisis head on, they have essentially had a financial response rather than a strategic response. And this could be depicted as killing reform with kindness. They are dispersing finances among their existing client base, and this is done in a way to obscure the level of crisis and to minimize the legitimate calls in the communities for root and branch reform of how official bodies deal with the Gaelic communities. This difficulty of the lack of clarity, but at the same time trying to control the debate, this has a very bad look among the public. This has the appearance of being controlling, but at the same time not accepting responsibility in their role for addressing the issue. We move ahead then, and if we look at academia then, and it's quite clear that there's been a high-profile debate, and there's been a plurality of perspectives, and that's all very positive, and that's what we would expect. And similar to a defensiveness in official bodies to protect existing approaches, we also have to recognize that there is a natural tendency in academia to protect existing discourses. But the ongoing challenge here is in protecting existing discourses. What could happen, as I stated here, there's a potential problem of academic institutions aligning too closely with existing structures, and that will lead essentially to a syndrome of a closed or circular debate informed only by status quo reasoning. And the risk emerging from that is quite clear, that we have this risk of public policy and aligned academics descending into a groupthink mode. Given the points about stasis and impasse, I think it's important that academia also acts positively to help break the impasse rather than to seeking to maintain institutional advantage. Okay, so looking ahead then, and we've had, as I said, plenty of officially sponsored consultation, but consultation without progress. And I think we have to look again at the context in which this consultation has been conducted. And we need to identify a few core values so that we have sincere consultation rather than what's happened up to now. We've consulted the communities back to the status quo, essentially. And I think we need four things. Clarity, that the political and institutional leaders would recognize clearly and stated publicly, recognize the level of crisis and admit the need for change. The other point is inclusion, that different voices need to be included and we require a plurality of perspectives in an open and sincere consultation. The issue of status of the participants, to use a phrase from Ireland, there should be parity of esteem for all participants, and there should be no privileged positions in this debate, in this dialogue. And we live in a liberal democracy, therefore we should prize open debate. And the onus is on the political and official leaders to ensure that there is a free exchange of ideas and that there is no detriment to critical voices, that we cannot have proper consultation unless we have an open discussion and discuss the positives and the negatives at the same time. Unless we have this clarity, inclusion, status and parity of esteem of the participants and an open debate, there is no way that we are going to break the impasse and move out of the stasis. If we have proper consultation, we will enhance Gaelic democracy, a benefit for all. And on my final slide, rather than consultation back to the status quo, what we require is consultation with progress. And I think we need to emphasize three things here. We need a new process, sincere consultation, and make it quite clear that this consultation is about the strategic preparation for the reform of existing structures. Emphasize the nature of the dialogue and facilitate it. And to do that, I think we need to set up a civic forum to consult on Gaelic strategy with the communities in the islands. And then to give a bit of strategic backup, we should set up a working group made up of community representatives, politicians, public servants, and academics to agree a strategic process to start addressing the various challenges that have been identified in the research. The aim of this healthy dialogue would be to seek an accommodation between the different Gaelic constituencies we have at the minute. And I think there are 4 constituencies in Gaelic affairs. The Vernacular Community, which is in crisis in the islands, the vestigial Gaelic vernacular networks in other places in the Highlands, the Gaelic networks, mainly urban, but in other places in Scotland, and then the networks of Gaelic learners in Scotland and in other places also. Unless all views and all constituencies are included, there is no way we can find accommodation. You cannot find accommodation by excluding people. And it's quite clear from our research and other consultations that the vernacular community feels excluded from the way Gaelic policy is formed at the minute. So therefore, the priority is to find mechanisms to include their voice in the consultations on reform for Gaelic policy, and then we can move ahead to find this overall accommodation that many people want. Thank you. I'll leave it like that and hand back to Pàdruig. Thank you. I'll just unshare as well.
Thanks very much, Prof. I'd like to go to the panel members individually now to see, to get their views both on the research and what Prof has just said. So if I can start with yourself, Pàdruig.
Hello, well, thank God. Thanks, Conchúr, for sharing those. And yes, it's been an interesting year, and a lot of discussion has been stimulated from this research being published. And much of what you say there, I think I find quite refreshing in a way to focus some of the minds at the moment on the discussion going forward. As I wrote about at the time when the research came out, I was slightly worried about the impact it might have on the people in these fragile communities, though I understood fully how necessary it was. And I thought kind of that the institutions might respond, but that the people on the ground may not. And yet there's been a slight degree of the opposite in some ways. And this is quite interesting. I think an early grassroots initiative that springboarded out of it, you know, a small thing on social media, Jane NicLeòid, led to young people, led to teenagers, young adults coming to me and speaking to me in Gaelic, having previously spoken to me in English. These young folk were making that huge fundamental change themselves. And it wasn't always me that was initiating it, and this has lasted. And all Gaelic speakers will recognise how significant a change in language from an established language of communication with someone is. And there's been other events in the last couple of weeks that I've been at where young folk are ensuring that the conversation is in Gaelic, and this is very positive. And perhaps to think slightly back from the Gaelic debate and more widely over the past year, there have been discussions around a number of other crises, around crofting, around housing, and to a slightly lesser extent also about climate. But there is definitely a sense of energy and agency. And as Conchúr mentioned, there's been work that I've been involved with the young group with housing. There's also been oversubscribed events on dealing with the crisis in accessing crofting. All these discussions are happening with huge energy from young folk, and perhaps more so than for a number of years and decades, in fact, young Islanders and young Gaels really having voice and speaking out and leaning in. And this is really important. But you know, in thinking about the activism that we all do, I remember a Pàdruig in South Uibhist that was spoken to a few years ago about Gaelic, and he said, "Hamish cumam in Gaelic," in the most perfect Jesach Gaelic, but ve cuma, and he didn't want to be a conscious activist, and the question that I ponder a lot at the moment and have been over the last week or so is the balance between us all being very conscious activists, but also aspiring for activism not to be conscious in so many folk. And if we, in a way, the worst case scenario that could come upon us is that if Gaelic is only as an act of activism, that means it's only activists speaking it. That means that Jesach won't speak to his children or grandchildren in Gaelic. A positive experience recently that I had of an event I organised around Máine in Grimsey was that it was a majority Gaelic event, old folk, young folk, and all speaking Gaelic, and it was unconscious. It wasn't an act of activism, and this had an impression on the folk that were there. And these kinds of events maybe involved me being a key activist in it, but to the Pàdruigs that were there, they weren't. It was the subconscious act of speaking Gaelic, which is when the whole cultural context of the language, the music, the history, the community, the Sgitheanach all survives and thrives. So the engagement, I'd say, with young folk and these initiatives is really positive. And I think people are recognising the interconnectedness of a number of issues. Like I said, the housing and the crofting, and you know, on my own island of Grimsey, one of the case studies in the research, I see that 4 houses have changed hands in the past year, and not one of them now has Gaelic spoken in them. If that doesn't show you how quickly the housing has an impact on the language, not sure what else does. And if other decision makers, if many decision makers were living in communities and seeing that here, perhaps decisions would be different. So I echo for a civic forum and for major organisations to have employees based here, to be able to act on that. And I've recently come across resistance from institutions in engaging with that. And so my kind of final statement would be to say, when there is this energy at the moment and people on the ground leaning in, I would urge organisations and some of the louder, more powerful voices in the debate to engage with these things, and that this just cannot wait. It can't wait. It must happen as soon as possible. Population.
Pàdruig, thanks very much for that thoughtful and refreshing, to your own word, contribution, and very positive to hear what's happening with young people in your area, and what the research has sparked there. More on time. I'll go now to yourself, Rhoda, for your views both on the research itself and the discussion on Conchúr's presentation.
agus tapl of Uibhist and Hoyam a bhí braineamh in June. We've had in the Comain. Thank you all for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. I'm very grateful for it. And Pàdruig, I love your framing, and I am also so excited to see the energy that is there in the younger generation. I'm starting to realize that I am becoming one of the older of the generations. A personal reflection, I think, initially is that this report reignited my own passion for Gaelic after a few years in the wilderness, and so you can decide for yourselves whether that is a good or a bad outcome. I didn't think Tidy was doing great. I thought it was doing not okay, but not dreadful. And I think that it took the ground out from under me a little bit. Plenty of us made jokes about not telling us anything we didn't already know, but the reality was that many of us didn't know in a data sense. We knew in a feeling sense, and we felt it, but it was there in the report in black and white. And zooming out, the situation as we know it is not black and white. So much of what Pàdruig said there is so true and is echoed across the Gaeltacht, which is that language is just one of the losses we're seeing in these communities. It's a piece of the puzzle, and that's what makes it so incredibly hard to grapple with and to find the right language for in a broader sense. In many places, Gaelic is actually the least of the community's worries right now. We're trying to hang on to resident populations. There have been positive changes. I think there's a risk that I sound kind of doom and gloom. I know that, but I think there has been a greater understanding and co-araching and co-feeling empathy from people who are a step removed, maybe from regularly spoken Gaelic. I think it has ignited a debate there as well. More and more people my age and younger are talking about their own guilt and loss and feelings around Gaelic, and I think that's crucial. And there has been more energy in younger people. It's fantastic, all the organisations and the movements that Pàdruig has talked about. And if I could appeal to the rest of us from my own experience, a lot of Gaelic politics with a big and a small P chewed me up and spat me out, and it's taken almost a decade to feel like I have the emotional energy to re-engage with this debate. So please create an environment where people feel safe to have that energy and enthusiasm, because it's the only thing that's going to get us through. So a year on, there's more discussion and growing honesty. I like the comment, a glimmer of light in the manifesto about island communities and the approach to Gaelic identity in them. And I do recognise that there are recommendations in the National Gaelic Plan for more actions. We see development worker posts being added. And I know the established bodies are not perfect, but they're not sitting on their thumbs and they don't have an easy remit at all. I don't envy them. I think one thing I noticed, and it's a slight digression, I guess, but most plans still hinge on education at a school level, and that does worry me quite genuinely. I was a child who started the first intake in GME in Edinburgh, and that wasn't yesterday. That was 33 years ago. And there have been a lot of kids through GME in that time, and we're still having the same conversations. And there's an element of Groundhog Day around quite a lot of things, but that's probably an essay for another time. I guess two main points that I want to make. Firstly is that we need each other. My own starting point is that the soul of our island communities are hurting. The Gaelic part is hurting, and so is the broader vernacular community. And it's my starting point because I see it day in and day out. We need those people so much. We need the Bodach who's coma to chat naturally and feel that he can. They're disenfranchised to an extent that they've made their peace with that loss, and they grieve it quietly and without fuss. And they do that because, to their detriment, it's just their way. We also need the indifferent, and we need the hopeless. We need the kids who went through GME and don't use Gaelic, or don't feel connected, or feel like their Gaelic's not proper or not good enough. And we don't talk about them either, ever, as far as I can tell. I know one of them very, very well, and she was part of the catalyst for that recent essay, because she is as conflicted and sad and angry as I am, but for very different reasons. we need the adults who almost learnt, the latent speakers with their heads full of Gaelic, but their tongues are tied, the people who don't speak, and they never will, but they love us and support us. We need the folks who've left the islands, who've learnt to incredible levels of fluency. And we need the Gaelic communities in urban areas. We should be really clear that we don't have a lot of the support and the language rights that we have today without those champions in the Central Belt and in Inverness and other communities. So we all have a stake. And if we all matter, and all these parts of the communities matter, which we do, point one, how do we move forward holistically in a way that doesn't leave people behind? And that's been what I've been trying to reflect on as a result of this research and the debate over the last year and the debate quite recently. And I genuinely question how one or two organisations can hope to engage all of these groups. I think that remit is far too big. And I think it means that we're always going to be pitted against each other for resources in different places and different competing interests. It's not all hopeless. You know, there's some incredible things going on in villages and communities and townships within larger islands and groups, and it's done in isolation out of necessity, because we can't organise CATs across multiple islands with our resources right now. It's incredibly hard. But I do think that that's part of what we need to do, and it's echoing the findings in the report around arisen na Gaelic. We need to find a way of loudly sharing success, of cross-pollinating, of embracing the dialects and difference, finding a way to make it safe for people to have that unconscious, as Pàdruig, I love how he describes that unconscious use. Yeah, we need to do more organising amongst ourselves and network better, and to share and talk and support and learn. And we need to talk about what we've got wrong and what we've lost, and how we bring the disengaged back in and learn from each other, learn from the brilliant stuff happening in Uibhist and Leòdhas. So when it comes to saving the local, I think a pan-island approach that is suggested in the report could be incredibly useful. My concern is that people are tired. We've been living on this hope and despair roller coaster for so long that people are exhausted. And I don't know if I or others have that nurse, that strength to kind of start that juggernaut. I hope we can find it. And I guess kind of like, as I will stop talking very shortly. If I'm battling in Tiriodh, I need to know that my Uibhist will have my back. I want to know that if I share my experience, it's met by support. That the Gaelic community, which was once right across Scotland, and is, you know, my passion for Gaelic originally was given to me by a teacher from Lewis who was teaching in Aberdeen. So, you know, these communities exist and can again, and I want them to be there to take up the message from the islands and run to Hollywood with it, or London, and find a way to work together that way. So I guess all of that's to say that a year ago, this report showed the differences in numbers and reignited the discussion. And we've seen in the last few weeks that discussion is painful because people and their identities don't fit in neat boxes. I certainly know that. And we need to do more to acknowledge those differences and the inherent value in different communities. We need to acknowledge the need for different approaches and places, and we need to collectively accept that we've got some things wrong and left people behind. And more than acknowledge, we need to do. So at the end of all of that, I don't want my language to die at all, but I really don't want it to die as a result of our inability to work together. Because right now, working together, in my opinion, involves focusing on our vernacular communities first and foremost, because they're not going to be here that much longer. And that is the biggest threat at this present moment. And the fact that a year later, we're still having to argue that point despite the data is part of the problem.
Thanks very much, Rhoda. And certainly, you're right. And when you said that the report has reignited your passion, and it was a very passionate contribution, and thank you for that. And also for your plea for the different Gaelic constituencies to unite behind the common goal and see the importance of the Gaelic vernacular community, the remaining ones in the islands. So, yeah, I think you're right. Well said. There's a comment there. Absolutely well said. And right, I think we all need to move on as a group, the different Gaelic constituencies, as far as possible. So, Apalach and either, I guess, H me who get pain and ish, Ian, or something, Yak, and Rappuch or Leo, I guess, as the word Crocker.
Tapalat, Patrick. Really, what I want to speak to is, I suppose, what's the impact of the report, and one of the things that it's precipitated, it seems to me at least, is that there's a shift going on in the collective consciousness in the public sphere that is both profound and unsettling for people. And I'm basing what I'm saying on, to a substantial degree, on what I'm seeing in the media and on social media, which I don't take to be the be all and the end all, but I do think that social media can give us a barometer on things, such as how people are feeling about Gaelic and what Gaels are thinking about the language and their own self-understanding. And I think a lot of this uncomfortable debate that we're seeing, and we've particularly seen in the last week or so, it's related to this shift, which for me is a shift away from thinking about Gaelic, which sees the language as freestanding and a discrete entity in itself, towards a way of thinking that understands the language to be part of something else that's bigger than just language. And that bigger thing, that structure of feeling and practice, is a very difficult thing to define, although I think we've had that done fairly well this week by Rhoda in her blog essay, and then again by Alistair McIntosh this morning in his Thought for the Day on BBC Radio Scotland. And the background to this shift, in my view, is that about 15 or 20 years ago, there was a move in Scottish Gaelic studies and social linguistics and language revitalisation in Scotland towards a new speaker approach, focusing on the need to acquire new speakers of Gaelic in Scotland, which is a good and a laudable aim in itself. And this also inevitably became an ideological project that sought to justify itself through argument. And within that project, and as part of that project, there began to be moves towards questioning the ethnonym or ethnic identifier Gael. And in this, there were two strategic moves. One was seeking to redefine the ethnonym in linguistic terms, to redeploy the term as a linguistic identity. And so in this case, Gael becomes Gaelic speaker and nothing else. And a second was to suggest that the term Gael might be becoming increasingly empty or hollow in its meaning, and to emphasize instead the use of language-based terms such as the Gaelic people. And these moves question the idea that language might have meaning for people beyond just the language itself. And this approach appears to have effectively captured the policy environment. So each morning I drop my child off at a Gaelic nursery, and there's a poster on the wall near the door that's made by Bordna Gaelic, who are the authority for Gaelic promotion in Scotland, and it presents 10 facts about Gaelic in Scotland. One of these is that Gaelic belongs to the whole of Scotland. Another says that Gaelic is inclusive, and it adds, whether you're from Cumbernauld, Carnoustie or Coatbridge, the Gaelic language belongs to you as much as it does to those from Castlebay, Carinish and Carradale. But this statement that everyone in Scotland belongs to Gaelic equally appears to discount the possibility that people might belong to the language or feel that the language belongs to them in different or in distinct ways, which might make a difference to the future of the language itself. So for instance, someone whose first language is Gaelic, who learnt it on their mother's and father's knees in a household and extended family and a community that was predominantly or entirely Gaelic speaking, may not have the same sense of connection or of belonging to the language as someone who, for instance, has learnt it as their fourth language as an adult. And by imposing a sameness on those two kinds of relationship to the language, it seems to me that rather than being inclusive, there's a form of exclusion at work here. To be truly inclusive, these statements would have to allow for the existence of different ways of belonging to the language, which may have an order and perhaps even be relatively systematic. And I remembered that poster this week when I read the views on social media of a former Bordna Gaelic board member who describes himself as 100% a Gael from the islands. And they were responding to someone who was writing about a sense of being slightly different by virtue of the particular way that they'd learned a language. And the former Bordna Gaelic member said, "This is so interesting. I feel like I'm not allowed to suggest this is the case with Gaelic. So desperate for new speakers, we don't acknowledge our own identity and accommodate anyone and everyone. Now, what I read there is the re-emergence and reassertion of a repressed or suppressed consciousness of a larger sense of self-understanding to which the language is integral, but which is about more than just the language alone. So for me, what's going on at the moment, and I think it's substantially as a result of this book, is that we're seeing on social media, for example, what that amounts to is an expansion in the collective consciousness relating to the language and identity. But I'm also aware that there'll be people for whom this shift represents not an expansion, but a contraction. People associated with the new speaker ideology and who've made that ideology not only part of their work, but part of their sense of self. And these are people for whom this collective consciousness shift that's going on might be decentering and distressing. And I think in response to that, when we read people associated with that ideology describe the current situation as toxic or bleak, or who believe that people are being demonizing or divisive, we need, as Rhoda advocated earlier this week, to try to hold more than one thing true in relation to this shift in consciousness. We can hold that our own experience in these terms, such as divisive or toxic, doesn't characterize the debate as a whole, that the evidence suggests to us that generally the debate's been held in a way that is aware of and allows for the deep sensitivities that are involved here. But at the same time, we can acknowledge that for people whose Gaelic consciousness may be contracting at the moment, they may genuinely believe the situation is toxic and bleak because it reflects their own distress and sense of being decentered. And I'm not saying we should try to stop this consciousness shift from happening. We can't. A collective process of this kind is unpredictable and uncontrollable. It's consciousness unfolding, continuing the process of becoming conscious of what it is. And I also happen to think this shift is probably the best chance we've got of maintaining Gaelic as a language of community in the islands. But it does ask us to constantly think about our contributions to making this change happen and to hold gently the feelings and views of those people for whom this recentering of Gaelic consciousness may be a deeply distressing experience. That's really what I wanted to say.
Yeah, you touched on a few issues there, the importance of culture as well as language, and its importance to identity. But there's room perhaps for different identities. And you touched on the history of the speakerism, ideological shift. Food for thought, certainly. Thanks very much for that. I'll go to yourself now, Jane. Jane's from Uibhist, and she's involved with Tiriodh. And Tiriodh.
Good morning. I'm in Lewis. I was teaching in Aberdeen before I moved back to the island. So I'm used to both worlds of Gaelic, that of education and the project to develop new communities, but also, I've been raised within the traditional community where Gaelic just arises. The book came to my consciousness last year while I was locked down in Lewis, and the findings weren't a surprise. I was seeing it every time I came back on holiday. Fewer and fewer people willing to speak Gaelic, even though they were very adept speakers. But what was new, and it was this the recommendation for support. Hitherto, any data, any analysis that said that the language was declining was always balanced with let's build new communities elsewhere instead, and rather than as well as this report suggested support of a new kind, and actually said no, it's not their fault, it is systemic minoritization. It isn't just the way we are. Rhoda alluded to that, but I think it's not our way. I think it's just a survival tactic, and that people are as active as they feel it is safe to be. So the book itself, it got cancelled. There was a bit of an echo chamber, and then there was a cancellation, and I think it was because of the review of literature, and that was a necessary corrective, I think, to the existing polemic that was drifting towards demonizing us to some extent, certainly critiquing us for the way our language is potentially dying. And I think it was a body shock for the establishment. I've just been joined by a dog. I hope I'm not being joined by a cat as well. We've been battling while I've been listening to everyone else. So perhaps that's why it got cancelled. Perhaps it is just how academia is. And I think for a while we were forgotten in that mix, because there was certainly a lot of silence in the media. We expected that we would hear more from our MSPs, from our councillors, from other academics, from other fields, and there was literally nothing. And maybe it was something to do with being locked down, different priorities, but it was an ideal time to instigate a debate. It didn't happen at all, and I felt that was intentional. So we started talking about things locally, and we tried to engage as well as we could with councillors, with institutions and organisations. And what we found was that there was a willingness to let us speak, but no real listening and no real response to that, which is how we ended up actually having to become activists. Just like Pàdruig says, the older generation were very reluctant activists, but there's a reason for it. It is that we've learned that it's not just that it won't work, but there are repercussions if people try to be activists. So we've started anyway, and what we found is that our own councillors don't reply to letters at all about anything to do with Gaelic. There is still that cancellation. Government and ministers have a very scant response, occasionally hostile, but mostly just ignoring what we have to say. Borden and Gaelic, they're busy with education, and we all know it. I'm a teacher, so I know fine. They're doing what they do as well as they can with what they've got. But as others have said, they can't do everything. And I think there is a need for new infrastructure, not massive infrastructure, but something that is local and suited to everyone. So in the last few weeks, since beginning to speak publicly, the local press have started to take a little bit from the national press. The stance from politicians is more polite than it was, but it's still more of the same. And in fact, they're talking now of potentially establishing a Gaeltacht, and it's very non-specific. Mishnach have tried to work with that to develop a plan that's good for everyone across Scotland. We're still very dubious of the whole idea. I think it might be a bit of a theme park. I suppose the one thing I would say is everyone speaks about inclusion, and we've been criticised for putting such a narrow focus on our own activism. It is part of a bigger picture for the islands and for everywhere else as well. It's not just about Gaelic, it's about housing and work. We would love to be representing learner needs as much as the vernacular, but we can't do everything. Just like everyone else, there are so few people who are active or able to speak. There are many people in organisations who speak to us saying what they would like to see happening because they haven't been listened to, and hoping that somehow this will filter through us towards government. And that's not the way anything should work. It's an outrageous way for people to have to work, that they, even if they dare speak, they're not going to be listened to. So it all takes time. We're all been busy. I think we're doing okay a year on. I think we'll do better in the coming year. We've come to the conclusion that the best start is to have an assembly, just because the first stage of Conchúr's emergency refocus model speaks about existing leaders taking the lead initially to establish democracy. We don't really have any existing leaders. That's become very obvious in the last year. So we think democracy first and then infrastructure, perhaps. What I'd like to see, like everyone else, is more local democracy. I'll focus on social fairness and diversity and plurality, just as Alderman MacKinnon was speaking about. I'm quoting Ezekiel, my Shana would be delighted to, my sure Shana, so now we're on it. Yes, it is all about displacement and restoration at this point, because we're not asking for anything new. We're asking to have certain things restored, and it's not, we're not, being reactionary or backward looking. Like restoration of democracy is not reactionary. So that's the main thing we're looking for. I'm really heartened by everything everyone else says. Pàdruig is right about the younger generation. We need to be there pushing them up and protecting them so that they can be the ones who do this. That's always been what we've done. Rhoda is sitting there with her process, and it's so everyone's. This is just exactly how we feel. That you're torn. There's a dissonance of knowing whether to just give up with dignity or whether to keep fighting, and everyone is exhausted by it. There's a mental exhaustion that comes when it's your actual identity. It's not a project. It's quite a different thing. So I would certainly, in the year ahead, if I'm looking ahead, I would hope to see an assembly established. I'd like to see UHI involving itself more. It's always been an interdisciplinary university when it comes to humanities. There are some excellent academics who should be speaking up about this. The recommendations shouldn't be coming from Edinburgh, because Edinburgh takes care of Edinburgh, and they certainly need support as well, in fact. And like I think Rhoda was saying, we do need to support each other. We need to support them, but they need to support us too. And our right to decide for ourselves what's best for ourselves. I would like to see our MSPs being a little bit more knowledgeable and committed. Rhoda Grant was really the only person we saw during the debate last week who seemed to take it seriously. So that's disappointing, and we are going to be badgering our councillors elections in a year's time, so they're going to be hearing from. That's where I would, a state of the island account for people. But I'm very heartened by everyone I see today. 2 years ago, this could not have happened, and I think that's the difference.
Jane, for your contribution. It's an area I know well. I'm a Tiriodh myself, and I'd like to congratulate the group for what they're doing. You mentioned, and Rhoda also mentioned, tiredness, exhaustion, frustration, I suppose. Did the research, in your view, has it led to any kind of increased energy in general among the communities, increased awareness of the condition of Gaelic there, and the determination to do what they can about it? Or is it in the communities at grassroots level, is it difficult to get people involved?
Now that we're coming out of lockdown, it's easier. I'm getting more people approaching me, like vernacular speakers wanting to return to using their Gaelic, maybe lost it, and learners as well. Certainly in the Barbers and Brew community, there's a plan to try and get more activity, more learning, because it's really all about learning for everyone. I always think education's the answer. So, lessons and opportunities to speak for everyone. A safe place for everyone, but a common place as well, because we finally do have full villages. They were dead for years, they were empty. And I would actually prefer a full house of people who might become Gaelic speakers than an empty house and a memory. So yes, people are starting to use their Gaelic a bit more. Maybe it is very conscious still, making an effort to find someone spot the person in the shop who might speak Gaelic. So we're a little bit like the Duolingo learners wanting to just seeking out opportunities for Gaelic at the moment.
Good for you. So the first year since the book has come out, you've been engaging with the officialdom, and have had, I think it's fair to say, mixed experiences there. It's difficult to get your voices heard by them. Why do you think that is?
I think it's the path dependency, and nobody is sure in any big organisation. Nobody wants to be the first to speak out particularly. There is line management. I wouldn't speak about education. I'm a teacher, so it's not my job. There are head teachers and massive infrastructure, and there has to be agreement and has to be process to find that agreement, and that hasn't happened. Both because they don't have time and there aren't enough of them, but also for some there is just the reluctance to see 10, 20 years of work turning out not to be quite as good or as useful as they had believed. So it's a contested space once everyone starts discussing things, and that's a difficult stage to go through.
Do you think your voice is being heard generally?
I do think so, but it spirals upwards. Things that just weren't heard 6 months ago, you can see again now, and now they are heard. But whether that means anything, it might be a process of absorption. The notion that we just want to get it off our chests and then we'll go away. We do actually want to see change happening, and for it to be properly effective and responsive and not reactive.
Jane. I'd like to thank the panel for their very thoughtful contributions from their various islands. I've enjoyed them. I'll read out a few comments that have come up in the chat box to me here now. Kirsty MacDonald agrees with yourself there, Pàdruig, and the context of the language, which a few people have mentioned, is being mentioned by a lot of people in the chat. It's not just a language, it's culture, it's a way of life. So it can't be seen as just a standalone linguistic issue. Katrina Ponihisak, Gaelic, says thanks, Pàdruig. And she feels that official Gaelic body officers and except for Gaelic development officers, any Gaelic development should be based in the islands. Agreement with yourself, Rhoda. A lot of people thought your speech was terrific, and a call for unity, as you did yourself, saying we can't do anything. The Gaelic group is too small to be at each other's throats, so to speak, about small ideological issues, and we need to unite. It's from Anne Prater. Another comment from Ryan Jakovich. What Pàdruig and Rhoda have said, the importance of the vernacular communities is the entire context of Gaelic, as much about the Gaelic activities, such as cutting the peats together, as about the Gaelic spoken while this happens. Udaya Narayana Singh suggests identifying leaders among younger generation Gaelic or any other similar language fighting for survival is the biggest challenge. And that should be looked at though. Another call for unity from Iain MacKinnon, raising their own contribution there, Rhoda, and saying Hajian Shin Purchase, Lenagale, and Habitin Taylor. So we can't make progress if we amongst each other. Brownhilt Josland has a question for yourself, Iain. Do you think that the shift in ethnic versus civic view of Gaels or Gaelic speakers is in any way linked with the Scottish Government's emphasis on civic nationalism in Scotland as a whole?
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Runich. I'm not very good technologically, and I'm struggling to follow the chat. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it. I hadn't thought of it in that way, but there may be a coincidence, and there is a coincidence in timing there. I think that would be something worth thinking about. I've thought about it more. I've really learned about it more from the Canadian context. In the issue of Quebecois, and the other is in the experience of First Nations, and but in that context, it's really been settler scholars, so people like Charles Taylor and James Tully, recognizing what's called difference-blind liberalism in their political societies, which seeks to homogenize based on certain principles of equality, but doesn't recognize, tends not to recognize diversity within that. And it seems to me that what we're seeing in Scotland may have strong parallels there. But the particular point that Runich makes is really interesting, and I hadn't thought on it. So thanks for it, and I will think on that.
Thanks, Ian. And here's another one for you from Anne Frater. She enjoyed the contribution, very nuanced. Would you say that people have been interpreting the findings of our research on a personal level rather than a community one?
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure they have. And that's pretty natural, isn't it? Yeah, I think they have, but I'd like to hear from Anne actually about what her feelings are on that, and I think finding some sort of balance of acknowledging that this is inevitably a very personal thing for all involved, but at the same time, there is a collective voice, or there are a number of collective voices that need to be heard and need to share and listen to others respectfully. I'm not sure we've found that balance yet in the debate, and I know that there are ways of holding, civic forums or citizen assemblies or citizen juries, and I have colleagues in Coventry who've done this in terms of agricultural issues in India, that can hold space for these kinds of dialogues to occur, and so again I concur with what perhaps a forum to hold those issues open in a way that allows both the personal feelings and the kind of collective needs to be heard. That something along those lines would be really, really helpful at this stage.
Thanks, Ian. Jane, now you have a message from Katrina Ponihisak talking about the mental exhaustion point you made. She says it's so right and so true, and perhaps a difficult thing for others to grasp. Ewan Kennedy would like to make a comment. I can't see if you can send your comment to Joe, Ewan, or wait until the end to open the microphones and come in then.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Great, and you can see me now as well.
I can see you fine.
Right, well, I'll be as quick as I possibly can. I came on here really to listen and not to make a contribution. And I would say I'm very, very deeply impressed by today's meeting, and very, very much in agreement with the suggestions that we should all really work together, although we come from very different perspectives. And Ian said, some people it's their fourth language. Well, actually it is really, because I started with English, a wee bit of Scots, I did French at school, did German about 20 years ago, and Gaelic is the most difficult one of the lot, but I've been 3 years down the road. Well, I was actually persuaded to start learning by coming across Andreas Wolf at Akeli, where he sang, and then it turned out I didn't realize he was from Berlin. And he said, well, I've done it, so you can do it too. So I'm coming from the perspective of what you might say an elderly, sort of typical sort of urban. I've been living in Mid-Argyll for about the last 30 years, but there's only 2 people here are native Gaelic speakers, and 3 when one of the sisters comes down from Oban. So I do get a tiny amount of conversation. But what I'm really trying to say is that there's a huge respect among people like me who are learning, and it's not just people who've got a sort of Scottish background, and we could argue all day about whether we're really Gaels or not. I mean, Hannig Lotulach a Badginach about 250 years ago, but I can't claim to be in any way a Gael in the sense that other people see themselves, but we all create our own, we all have our own view of our individual identities, whether we're Scottish or British or European, etc., etc. But what I've got out of today is that there's a whole lot of different constituencies, but they're all working, they're all keen on they all want to keep Gaelic alive. There is a respect among people who are learning for the community, and of course there are massive problems in Scotland just now, and they're particularly acute in the islands, as we all know, quite acute where I am in the middle of Argyll. But in a sense, these are some parts of the country are separate from the really acute issues, which I'm acutely aware of in some of the islands. But what I'd like to say is people like me are actually not mentally exhausted. We've got time because I'm 73 and I don't work anymore, although I do build boats and do all sorts of stuff, but I've got time for Gaelic. I spend a lot of time on Gaelic, and I've actually persuaded a few people to take it up. I persuaded a friend of mine who sings Gaelic songs. She's a professional, I won't name her. But she's now on Duolingo and encouraging her. So I persuaded a few people to start. And also, dare I say, some of us have got resources which are currently untapped because people are not being brought into the general the wider community. And of course, you only get in touch with people quite randomly when you're on a course at Salmar Rostig and you meet people and then you stay in touch afterwards. So I just say collective approach, recognizing we're all different, and discovering what resources everybody's got and trying to bring it together. So thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Ewan. There's a few people lining up who would like to ask a question. If I can go to Travis Richardson.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. Good. Hi, I'm joining you all from the United States this morning. So sorry my camera isn't on. It's 6 o'clock in the morning here and I'm just not presentable really. But first of all, I want to say I'm obviously not Scottish. I learned about this event through one of the different forums that I follow. So thank you for allowing me to come into your space to listen to all of your fascinating inputs that you have on the status of Gaelic currently being spoken. I work in Indigenous language revitalization here in the United States, currently with the Zuni reservation, working with the Zuni language there. And so as a lover of language, as a lover of culture, and someone who wants to see these, especially Indigenous languages, be revitalized and be brought to the front of the public sphere, I was interested in hearing about the status of your language over there in Scotland. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Currently, my question that I have mostly goes a lot off of what Mr. Iain was saying, but also off of what Rhoda and Pàdruig were saying as well, concerning the intersectionality of different identities with being a Gaelic speaker as well. So kind of encompassing what is this Gael community, that if there is a Gael community being created, and how the language focuses in on that, but more so how different identities are being indexed via speaking Gaelic. For example, an LGBT identity, or you know, the differences between socioeconomic identities, and how, if those linguistic communities exist, and how Gaelic is being used in indexing various different identities.
Thanks very much, Travis. Very interesting comparison you made there, and you're working in minority languages yourself. So thanks for that. Could I bring in Shona now?
Isgama Harston, Dochus Gavilshiv, all Ula Goma, Hami Fiakan Camerakam, Uhur Eir, I guess I'm fighting to Marination. Thanks very much. I missed almost all the presentations, I'm afraid, because I already had meetings scheduled that I couldn't change. So I'm looking forward to listening to them later. But I thought it might be helpful. I'm Shona McLennan, I'm the Chief Executive of Bordna Gaelic, and I thought it might be helpful to give a little bit of information about some of the things that have been happening both at Bordna Gaelic's hand and working with different groups. Some of it over the last year, some of it goes further back, and I think I would set it in context of the research that Soillse carried out in 2017, which was the same time as the current National Gaelic Language Plan was being prepared. And in that, and I think there are a lot of similarities in the messages in Soillse's research and the book and in the national plan. And the main message, the key message in the national plan is that we need to grow using Gaelic. Using Gaelic is the priority. How do we increase that? And as a strategy for that, we recognise there are 3 different types of communities. And those different communities need different strategies. And so very specifically, it describes in the national plan about the island and rural communities where Gaelic language is still in daily use. There's also the towns and cities, which are growing and are primarily based around education. And then, of course, we see the online community, which has grown significantly since lockdown. That's been hugely important. And in thinking about the island and rural communities, the plan says quite clearly wider issues have an impact on those communities, and they are, of course, economic opportunity, housing, transport, connectivity, the things that are necessary for sustainable communities in island and rural areas. And I don't know if any of you noticed on social media yesterday that we tweeted a response we've just put into Transport Scotland, recommending that free bus travel for under 22s should be extended to free ferry travel for under 22s, because if you live in Tiriodh or Eriskay or Barra, free bus travel isn't very significant, but free ferry travel could have a major impact on your social and cultural and sporting life. So I think there are strong messages there. We also recognise the vulnerability of the island communities, particularly about being sustainable communities and sustaining the language within that. And over the last year in particular, a number of developments put in place to strengthen Gaelic in the island communities, particularly around increasing the number of officers who work with communities to increase the use of Gaelic, setting up a network for community officers to increase their support. Many of them often work in isolation. So increasing collaboration, increasing professional knowledge and skills. And of course, the other development which is taking forward the community empowerment agenda. It's not the answer to everything, but it's taking it forward. And that's about the partnership with Community Land Scotland. Because as we know, much of the Western Isles is now in community land ownership. held by trusts. The historical societies, the Comunitary, are very active, and the arts sector are very active. So this is establishing a fund which will support communities using Gaelic, and the decision-making process on that will be made by local representatives. So taking funding, putting it into the hands of local people. And the other thing that I think is probably just worth noting, we've been preparing our annual report, and in that we give a report on where our development funding has gone over the last 2 years. And there was 1.4 million of our funding, that's about 40% of our development funding, allocated to the Western Isles in 2021, and about another 40% went to Highlands. So between the Highlands and Islands, about 80% of Bord na Gaelic's development budget was allocated to projects and organisations in that area. And I caught some comments, some other people commenting just now about collaboration, and I would urge us all to collaborate and work together. The Gaelic community is very small, and I think if we are divided, we create greater risks for the sustenance and the growth of Gaelic. And there are enough people who would be perfectly happy to see Gaelic die out. And I think we need to stand strong together and use our supporters as well as speakers to strengthen Gaelic. But as I say, I'm sorry I didn't see the other presentations, but look forward to doing that. I'm happy to talk at any time about them. So tang a Patrick Erson Corum Shinara.
So we've heard from Shona from Bord na Gaelic and her views. We've heard from some of the panel members the difficulties they've experienced in dealing with officialdom at various levels. And sometimes it can be very frustrating. Would any member of the panel like to reply to Shona?
Father, can I come in there? I think there's plenty of other people in the audience who want to make a comment. The time is running tight now, so we should, anybody else who would like to make a comment, we should invite them now, I think.
Okay, I'll go to Eileen.
Hi, thanks very much for the session today. I found it really very, very insightful, and I'd like to thank all the participants who've shared their thoughts and their views. I think it's been a really very valuable experience. And although I felt a little bit that I was kind of eavesdropping because it was taking place in English, and I thought, you know, I hope that you're having these conversations with yourselves in using the language rather than, you know, just talking about the language and about the situation, because even though you can express all kinds of things in English as well, can't you, with people like me listening in, it's really important to have that conversation in the language, in the context, and I'm sure that you're having them. One of the things that struck me as well was, you know, the ideology of the new speaker and so on. I think that there's been a lot of enthusiasm to take up this ideology because we felt that, to take up this terminology, sorry. I think that because we felt that the term adult learner wasn't sufficient, and that we think that the new speaker is a more neutral term. And I think that one of the things that we're looking at here in Wales at the moment is whether we really want to adopt the terminology new speaker or not, whether it does actually make sense in our cultural and social and political context to take that terminology on, whether we want to really introduce a new terminology that actually exacerbates the differences and dilutes the continuum of speakers. And that's something that that we're going through at the moment, I think. And so I think that you are further ahead in that conversation about adopting the terminology new speakers than we are. And I'm just thinking, you know, whether this is also a moment to pause about some of that work too. But I don't want to take up time. I just like to thank you very much for the opportunity to listen, and I take a lot from what I've heard this morning.
Thanks very much, Aileen, for your contribution there, and for your comparison with the Welsh situation. We're running out of time a little bit now, so I'll have to move on fairly quickly to any questions. Fiona, would you like to come in? Hello, Fiona. Okay, she doesn't seem to be there, or if she's there, she doesn't seem to be hearing. I'll run through a few of the comments then, unless anyone would like to come in with a comment at the moment. We're scrolling through a lot of the comments here. Here's a question for the panelists from Drew McNaughton. I have a question for the panelists, all of whom I have the utmost respect for. If there's a message you would like to give the UN, COP and the UK government, what would that be? Anyone on the panel, would you like to come in on that?
Patrick, I'm not sure I have a message for the COP, but I do think that what we've been discussing in terms of the kind of the multiple issues, multiple crises, you might call it, in the islands in relation to language, culture, housing, access to land, and the historical dimension of that, particularly when you draw in the crofting land struggle, speaks to the marginalisation of indigenous cultures under colonial capitalist circumstances. And of course, the climate crisis is perhaps the most acute global expression of that at the moment. And I do wonder, as we recover our voice as Gaels, that we might also start to recover some of our concepts and ways in which we've worked with nature and with society, and in terms of our larger sense of spirituality, and that in time, as we recover those, they may indeed have something to speak to some of these larger international and global concerns. So I would certainly offer solidarity to those who are seeking to influence the climate debate, but I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't want to speak on behalf of Gaelic or Gaels on that.
Iain. Rhoda?
Yeah, I will have to think about that.
Sure. Would any other member of the panel like to come in on that one? Any message you'd like to send?
I suppose I'd like to point out that we're not ethnicizing Gaelic. There's always been in community. The removal of language from community is quite recent, and it has done harm. And we need to get back to, as Iain put it, he has maybe misread that poster as Gaelic belongs to everyone, whereas he understood it as everyone belongs to Gaelic. And that is certainly how young learners understand it as well. They want to belong to Gaelic, and for them to be able to interpret it in their own way, it has to belong to everyone at the grassroots level, and for it to be accessible to everyone. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that there is difference, and we don't all have to be the same to be equal. We can be quite different and have quite different needs and still be able to meet in a common place.
Pàdruig, is tócha go bhfuil Kirsty MacDonald, Kirsty MacDonald would like to, and there's a few others there.
Is there? I must be missing
Yeah.
them. Okay, Kirsty, do it.
Hello, Carsten. Hi. Sorry, but I was trying to get my video started. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you and I can see you fine. On you go.
Thanks. I'll be as quick as I can. First of all, I want to thank everybody for what they have said. I agree with all the comments. I want to say how important I think it is that everybody feels equal as a Gaelic speaker. Nobody should be more important than the other. But I have been very emotional over the last couple of weeks about this, being from North Uibhist, and I just wanted to pick up on what Iain was saying, and I think about the importance of dialogue. I have friends who are amongst those who find the debate toxic. I am a person who considers myself Indigenous, and my feelings on that are very strong, but that doesn't mean that I think that I'm any better or more important than anybody else who speaks Gaelic. Just as Jane was saying, it's just different. And I wanted to just say a little bit about my concerns on as these things, as this debate continues, and I hope it will, concerns around looking after the mental health of people who are trying to open up and reassess where they stand as a Gaelic speaker. And you know, we know the effects of suppressing anything on people's mental health, and I think for perhaps some time Gaels may have felt that they have had to suppress their, I mean, this is just an, and I'm not saying this, I'm not an expert, but that they may have felt that they have had to suppress their feelings of indigeneity, because we know how important it is that people learn and that we need more speakers. So I just wanted to say a little bit about that I agree with Iain about looking into the ideas of, you know, some sort of citizens' assembly where everybody can get around the table and talk openly and honestly about all the different identities, about the intersectionality, about feelings, and all support each other and make sure that we all feel heard and that nobody is marginalised in this debate. I guess, Jane NicLeòid, thank you for letting me comment.
We've been waiting for a while to get in there. My apologies. And another call for unity, which I think is the message from this meeting. We have maybe a couple of minutes. Two chiefs been waiting for a while. Should they introduce them?
Thank Patrick. Will we gan plointje?
I got points. I guess I got bacon.
Mille tain goed. Agus taingers on de holle dunje son na bergen son bergen agus son jespet mun Leòdhas a haast hokutemo nulle. The passage of a year since the publication of the crisis in the vernacular community is a very important milestone, and I'm very conscious of having a very strong interest, but in the issues highlighted, but yet not being an effective stormtrooper, as it were, in this, since we've been using the metaphor of war and struggle. But I do consider that from my standpoint, I can bring quite a lot to bear as, if you like, a foot soldier in the back ranks with a strong interest in all this. And my particular interest is in dialect and terminology of everyday life and how that can be brought forward. And I've been privileged to have the chance to do that at Selmore Ostig for the last 14 or 15 years. And I've learnt enough to give myself huge encouragement that it's worthwhile and that it has a modest part to play in the strengthening of the vernacular community, in so much as we can feed back what we are finding in our own researches. Tain Bora Patrick, I guess Tain Crocker, could you?
I think we might have time just to squeeze in one more contribution. Jane on the plate there.
Tá Patrick, ar sé gan chláidin ceir I was just a few points. You know, there's a lot of the debate on social media has been quite uncomfortable to read, whichever side of it you're on. But it just struck me that the people who are involved on both sides of that debate are actually not the people we need, because a lot of the people who are on all these Gaelic forums all over Twitter and Facebook are not the body in the loom shed. They're not crofted fishermen. They're not the people who are in ordinary everyday jobs and using Gaelic as part of their ordinary everyday life. So there's a danger that even in debating the findings, even in the fora that we are using to discuss the findings, we're still excluding the people that we really, really need to get into contact with and get activated. I just I agree with Jane that the Irish local council here could definitely be doing a lot more. You know, the much vaunted Gaelic first policy is a damp squib because they didn't make it. They made it up. They still made it optional. I mean, one of my brothers moved to Wales when his children were in late primary. They had to learn Welsh. There was no option. There was no excuse accepted that they'd lived in Yorkshire for the previous 10 years. You're in Wales now, you have to do Welsh. And I really think that there is an argument for something radical to be done at local council level. Yes, there will be a huge kickback. I'm well aware of that. But I think we are at the stage now where we have to start putting our money where their mouth is. And I'll just quickly go, because that links to my last point, which is, in some ways, there are conflicting policies like repopulation versus language preservation, plus also the expansion of Gaelic medium education in the non-Gaelic areas is also sucking Gaelic-speaking teachers out of the Gaelic-speaking areas. And these are usually young folk in their 20s, and they don't come back. And so there are things like this that need to be looked at. We do need to look at things much more in the round at, you know, expansion in one area. What effect is that having on another? And there will be no easy answers. And I think we really have to accept that there are no easy answers. And as I said to somebody about this time last year, and that's the way we have to be, I think.
And that's and I think that's a fitting comment to end on. We could go on, I'm sure we
Father, just rather than I know we've gone past the time, but if we could just extend by, just in case people, I don't want anybody to feel they're cut off. No. Davy Eyre wanted to speak, so we'll just extend to give people an opportunity to talk. Davy Allen?
Sorry, there's some issue with his settings, so unfortunately we can't turn the microphone or the video on. So perhaps just in the chat from Davy. Okay. And is there anybody else at this stage who'd like to talk, in case we've missed them in the chat function? Just not to exclude anybody from the debate. That might be it then.
That might be it. That might be. I think Anna Fleet had the final word, and so Tapalatis and Shin on that. I'd like to thank everyone in attendance here today, for coming, for listening. I'd especially like to thank Prof for his presentation, and I'd like to thank the members of the panel and everyone who's made a contribution here today. Happily, it's been a very positive meeting, and I think everyone is calling for unity. There's a general feeling that there should be some kind of forum for Gaelic speakers in the islands for their voices to be heard and to have a say in Gaelic development in their own communities. And I think that's a good thing. And it's great to see that the publication of the book has by all accounts, certainly sparked a debate and certainly has reignited some positive energy in the Gaelic communities. And 1 year on, that's not too bad. So, Papalite.